You know what's absolutely insane? Imagine being told your idea is so stupid, so impossible, that your own colleagues laugh in your face. Now imagine that same idea saving an entire nation and becoming the most produced combat aircraft in human history. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from, and if you've ever heard of the aircraft they called the Black Death. Here's something most people don't know about World War II. While we talk about the Spitfires, the Mustangs, the legendary fighters that danced through the clouds, there was one aircraft that changed everything, and it wasn't elegant, it wasn't fast, it was barely even metal. This is the story of how one man's insane vision, ridiculed by experts, dismissed by committees, and built from literal scraps and desperation, became the weapon that made hardened German soldiers pray they wouldn't see its shadow. This is about the Il-2 Sturmovik, the flying tank that took 1,000 bullets and kept flying, and the stubborn genius who refused to let anyone tell him it couldn't be done. Let me take you back to 1942. The Soviet Union is burning. German forces have pushed deep into Russian territory, their Luftwaffe dominating the skies with ruthless efficiency. Soviet pilots are being slaughtered. Their aircraft, outdated and fragile, fall from the sky like autumn leaves. The Red Army is desperate for something, anything that can turn the tide. Ground troops are being massacred from above, and there's nothing they can do about it. The situation is beyond critical. It's apocalyptic. And in the middle of this chaos, in a cramped design bureau in Moscow, there's a man named Sergey Vladimirovich Ilyushin. Now, you need to understand who this man was. Ilyushin wasn't some privileged aristocrat or academic elite. He was born into a peasant family so poor that he worked as a ditch digger and construction laborer just to survive. He taught himself engineering, read books by candlelight, clawed his way into aviation school through sheer bloody-minded determination. By 1942, he'd already established himself as a brilliant but unconventional designer. His colleagues respected him, sure, but they also thought he was a bit obsessed, a bit too willing to chase ideas that seemed impossible. And then Ilyushin walks into a military design committee meeting and presents his proposal. Picture this room: senior military officials, experienced aircraft designers, everyone exhausted, everyone desperate for a miracle. And Ilyushin stands up and says he wants to build a ground attack aircraft that can survive direct hits from anti-aircraft fire. Not dodge them, survive them. An aircraft armored so heavily it becomes essentially a flying tank. But here's the catch, the absolutely mad part. Because of the Soviet Union's desperate metal shortage, significant portions of this aircraft would need to be made from wood. The room goes silent. Then someone laughs. Then someone else. Within minutes, the entire committee is barely holding back their derision. A senior designer stands up and says, "Sergey Vladimirovich, with all due respect, you're proposing we build a coffin with wings. This thing will be too heavy to fly, too slow to avoid fire. And when it inevitably gets hit, our pilots will burn alive in a wooden box." Another voice chimes in. "The Germans will shoot these things down for target practice. You're asking us to send our boys to die in your experimental fantasy." But here's what they didn't understand about Ilyushin. This wasn't just professional pride. This man had spent years watching Soviet pilots die in inadequate aircraft. He'd seen the reports, read the letters from the front, heard the stories of young men burning alive because their planes had no protection. He'd visited field hospitals and seen what anti-aircraft fire did to human bodies when there was nothing between them and the bullets. This wasn't theoretical for him. It was personal. It was moral. So Ilyushin doesn't back down. His voice stays calm, measured, almost eerily quiet. He says, "Gentlemen, you're thinking about this wrong. You're thinking about aviation. I'm thinking about survival. Our pilots are already dying. What I'm proposing won't make them invincible, but it will give them a chance. The armor plating won't be attached to the aircraft. It will be the aircraft. The fuselage itself will be an armored shell. Yes, it will be heavy. Yes, it will be slow, but it will come back. And that, comrades, is what matters." The committee remains skeptical. But there's something about Ilyushin's conviction that's unshakable. And frankly, they're out of options. They give him limited resources, a small team, and essentially tell him to prove it or shut up about it. Most people in the room are already writing off his project as a waste of precious time and materials. They literally refer to his design as Ilyushin's flying coffin behind his back. The nickname spreads. Even some of his own team members have doubts. But Ilyushin gets to work with an intensity that borders on manic. He's in the design bureau before dawn, working by lamplight until midnight. His team watches him obsess over every detail. The armor plating has to be thick enough to stop bullets, but light enough to allow flight. The wooden components have to be strategically placed where weight matters less. The engine placement, the fuel tanks, the pilot's position, everything has to be rethought from the ground up. This isn't modification, this is revolution. And here's where Ilyushin's genius really shows. He doesn't just add armor to a plane. He creates an entirely new concept. The front section of the aircraft, from the engine to behind the pilot, becomes a single armored shell made of welded steel plates up to 12 millimeters thick in critical areas. This armored bathtub, as it becomes known, protects the engine, the fuel system, the radiator, and most importantly, the pilot. The armor isn't bolted on. It's structural. It holds the aircraft together. It is the aircraft's frame in the most vulnerable sections. For the rear fuselage and other less critical areas, Ilyushin uses wood, specifically a special plywood construction that's lighter but still surprisingly resilient. This hybrid design, part flying tank, part wooden warrior, is unlike anything anyone has attempted before. It's aviation heresy. It violates every principle of aircraft design. Planes are supposed to be light, agile, elegant. This thing is a brute, a flying sledgehammer. Months pass. The team works around the clock. Resources are scarce. The war is getting worse. There are moments when even Ilyushin's closest collaborators wonder if they're wasting time that could be spent on conventional solutions. The pressure is crushing. Every day delayed is more Soviet soldiers dying without air support. Finally, in late 1942, the first prototype is ready. The Il-2 Sturmovik rolls out onto the airfield, and honestly, it's not impressive to look at. It's bulky, ungainly, with a thick, hunched profile that makes it look more like a flying bathtub than a weapon of war. Test pilots look at it with obvious apprehension. The consensus among observers is that this thing will either never get off the ground or will fly like a pregnant duck. The first test pilot climbs into the cockpit. The engine roars to life, and you can feel the raw power, but also the strain. This aircraft is heavy. The takeoff run is long, painfully long. The plane lumbers down the runway, and for a moment it seems like it won't make it, like the critics were right. But then, slowly, grudgingly, the Il-2 lifts off the ground. It's not graceful, it's not fast, but it flies. The initial flight tests reveal exactly what the critics feared. The Il-2 is slow, with a maximum speed of only about 400 kilometers per hour, pedestrian by fighter standards. It handles like a truck. Its maneuverability is limited. In a dogfight with a German fighter, it would be helpless. Every conventional metric says this aircraft is a failure. The whispers start again. Ilyushin's folly. The flying coffin lives up to its name. But then comes the weapons test, the ground attack simulation, and this is where everything changes. They equip the Il-2 with rockets, bombs, and machine guns, and send it on a simulated ground attack run. The pilot comes in low, devastatingly low, and unleashes hell on the target range. The combination of firepower and the ability to fly at extremely low altitudes, something faster, lighter aircraft would never risk, is spectacular. And then comes the real test. The durability trial. They set up anti-aircraft guns, real guns, firing real ammunition at the Il-2 as it makes attack runs. This is the moment of truth. Everyone watches. Some people are literally holding their breath. The Il-2 makes its approach. The guns open. Fire. The sound is deafening. A brutal staccato of anti-aircraft rounds tearing through the air. Tracers light up the sky. The Il-2 flies directly through the barrage. Bullets strike the aircraft. You can hear the impacts, see the sparks. Everyone watching expects to see the plane explode, or shudder, or fall from the sky. But the Il-2 just keeps flying. It completes its attack run, releases its payload, and circles back. They bring it in for landing, and when the ground crew inspects it, they find dozens of bullet strikes on the armored sections. Dozens. The armor is dented, scarred, scratched, but not penetrated. The pilot is unharmed. The critical systems are intact. The silence on that airfield is profound. Then someone starts clapping. Then another person. Within seconds, the entire assembly is erupting in applause and disbelief. Sergey Ilyushin stands there, not smiling, not celebrating, just watching his creation with quiet vindication. His voice, when he finally speaks, is soft, but carries across the field. Gentlemen, we don't have a flying coffin, we have a flying tank. The Il-2 goes into production immediately. Stalin himself, when briefed on the aircraft's capabilities, makes the Il-2 the highest production priority in Soviet aviation. Factories are retooled, resources are redirected. The aircraft that was laughed at, dismissed, called impossible, becomes the centerpiece of Soviet air strategy, and then it goes to war. The first combat missions of the Il-2 are tentative. Pilots are still skeptical. The German forces initially view these slow, bulky aircraft with almost amusement. Easy targets, they think. But then the Il-2s come in low, terrifyingly low, sometimes flying at just 50 feet above the ground, and they unleash absolute devastation on German tank columns, supply lines, and troop concentrations. And when the Germans shoot back, when anti-aircraft fire tears through the sky, the Il-2s just keep coming. German soldiers start reporting something that sounds like propaganda but isn't. They're shooting at these aircraft, hitting them repeatedly, and the planes aren't going down. They're watching bullets bounce off the armor, seeing sparks fly from direct hits, and the aircraft continuing their attack runs as if nothing happened. The psychological impact is enormous. If you can't stop something, if you empty your gun into it and it keeps coming, terror follows. The Germans give the Il-2 a nickname, Schwarzer Tod, the Black Death. They start to genuinely fear it. After-action reports from German units describe the Il-2 as nearly indestructible. One report states, "These aircraft can take more punishment than any plane we have encountered. Our standard anti-aircraft fire seems almost ineffective." Morale among troops is suffering because they feel helpless against these attacks. Soviet pilots, meanwhile, are experiencing something revolutionary. They're coming back from missions. In previous aircraft, a single burst of ground fire could be fatal. In the Il-2, pilots are returning with aircraft that look like they've been through a metal shredder but are still flyable. One pilot returns with over 200 bullet holes in his Il-2. Another lands with half his tail shot away but alive. The stories spread. The flying coffin becomes a symbol of Soviet resilience and ingenuity. But let's be clear about something important. The Il-2 wasn't invincible. Pilots still died. The wooden rear sections were vulnerable. The early single-seat versions left the pilot exposed from behind. When the Soviets added a rear gunner in later models, that gunner's position was far less protected, and rear gunners had some of the highest casualty rates in the Soviet Air Force. This wasn't a miracle machine. It was a calculated trade-off, survivability in exchange for speed and agility. What made the Il-2 truly revolutionary wasn't just its armor, it was Ilyushin's holistic vision. He understood that ground attack aircraft needed to be thought of differently. They weren't fighters, they were airborne artillery. They needed to survive long enough to deliver their payload and get home. Everything else was secondary. This mindset, this willingness to completely abandon conventional thinking, was what his critics couldn't grasp initially. By 1943, the Il-2 is everywhere on the Eastern Front. Production numbers are staggering. Over 36,000 Il-2s will eventually be built, making it the most produced combat aircraft in history. Think about that. An aircraft that was laughed at, that experts said would never work, becomes the most manufactured warplane ever created. Factory workers paint messages on the aircraft. For the motherland, revenge for our brothers, death to the invaders. The impact on the war is measurable. German tank crews report higher losses when Il-2s are active. Supply convoys refuse to move in daylight when Sturmoviks are in the area. The Il-2's rockets and bombs are devastatingly effective against armored vehicles, and the psychological warfare component cannot be overstated. Soviet ground forces know that when they hear the distinctive sound of Sturmovik engines, help is coming. German forces hear the same sound and brace for devastation. But here's where the story gets even more profound. Remember those critics? Those designers and military officials who laughed at Ilyushin? As the war progresses and the Il-2's success becomes undeniable, something interesting happens. Some of them approach Ilyushin privately. One particular senior designer, a man who had been especially vocal in his mockery during that initial presentation, requests a meeting with Ilyushin in late 1943. They meet in Ilyushin's office, a Spartan room filled with technical drawings and reports from the front. The senior designer, a man named Petrov in our story, looks older than his years, worn down by the war and perhaps by something else. He sits down and there's this long, uncomfortable silence. Finally he speaks, and his voice is heavy with something that sounds like shame. "Sergey Vladimirovich, I owe you an apology. Actually, I owe you more than that. I owe you my conscience." Ilyushin looks up from his papers, his expression neutral, waiting. Petrov continues, his hands shaking slightly. "When you presented the Il-2 concept, I laughed. I mocked you in that meeting and afterwards. I called your design a flying coffin. I tried to convince others to deny you resources. I thought I was being realistic, experienced, wise. I thought you were being dangerously idealistic. and wasting time we didn't have. He pauses, and you can see emotion cracking through his professional demeanor. My nephew was a pilot. He flew Yak-1s in 1942. He was shot down in his third mission, 22 years old, burned alive because there was nothing protecting him. The air in the office becomes heavy. Petrov's voice drops to almost a whisper. Last month, I visited a forward airfield. I watched Il-2 pilots return from missions. I saw aircraft with so many bullet holes they looked like sieves. But the pilots walked away. One pilot, he couldn't have been more than 25. He showed me where a bullet hit his armored seat. The impact knocked the wind out of him, he said. But the armor stopped it. He lived. And I stood there thinking about my nephew and about every pilot we lost in inadequate aircraft. And I realized something terrible. My expertise, my realism, my mockery of your vision, that wasn't wisdom. That was cowardice disguised as pragmatism. Ilyushin lets the silence sit for a moment. When he finally speaks, his voice is gentle, without any trace of vindication or anger. Comrade Petrov, we were all doing what we thought was right with the information we had. You weren't wrong to be skeptical. The Il-2 was a gamble. It could have failed spectacularly. The difference wasn't intelligence or expertise. The difference was that I had nothing to lose by trying. You had a reputation to protect, a career, professional standing. I understand that. But Petrov shakes his head vigorously. No, you're being too kind. The difference was that you cared more about the pilots than about being right. I cared more about my professional judgment than about the lives we were losing. That's not skepticism. That's moral failure. He looks directly at Ilyushin now, and there are tears in his eyes. How many more pilots like my nephew died because people like me delayed your project? How many boys burned alive in those extra months because I was too proud to admit I might be wrong? This moment, this conversation, it's not in the official histories, but it represents something profound that happened across the Soviet aviation industry. The Il-2's success forced a reckoning. It challenged the assumption that established experts always knew best. It demonstrated that innovation sometimes requires believing in something that looks impossible, and it revealed something uncomfortable about how professional pride can masquerade as wisdom. Ilyushin stands up and walks to his window, looking out at the design bureau's workshop. Comrade Petrov, do you know what the pilots call the Il-2 now? Not the flying coffin. They call it the savior, the guardian angel. One pilot wrote to me saying the Il-2 is the difference between a mission and a suicide run. That's what matters, not who was right in a meeting 2 years ago. What matters is that we learned, we adapted, and we saved lives. He turns back to Petrov. You want to make amends? Then take this lesson into whatever you design next. Take the lesson that the safest looking option isn't always the safest, that sometimes protecting our people requires us to risk looking foolish. That innovation isn't just about technology, it's about moral courage. Can you do that? Petrov nods, unable to speak, and extends his hand. Ilyushin shakes it firmly. And in that handshake, there's something bigger than personal reconciliation. There's a recognition that progress requires both the dreamers willing to look foolish and the skeptics willing to admit they were wrong. The war continues, and the Il-2 continues to prove itself. By 1945, when Soviet forces push into Germany itself, the Sturmovik is there, providing the air support that helped turn the tide. The final production numbers tell an incredible story. 36,183 aircraft built. More than any other combat aircraft in history. Each one, a testament to Sergey Ilyushin's stubborn refusal to accept that his vision was impossible. After the war, Ilyushin becomes one of the Soviet Union's most decorated aircraft designers. But here's what's really remarkable. When interviewed about the Il-2's success, he doesn't talk about vindication or proving people wrong. He talks about the letters he received from pilots and their families. He talks about the factory workers who built the aircraft with their own hands. He talks about the collective effort and sacrifice. One interview from 1946 captures his philosophy perfectly. The interviewer asks him, Comrade Ilyushin, how did you know the Il-2 would work when everyone said it was impossible? And Ilyushin responds with this, I didn't know it would work. I knew it had to work. There's a difference. When you know something has to be done, when lives depend on it, impossibility becomes irrelevant. You find a way, or you die trying. That's not genius. That's obligation. That response, that perspective, It reveals everything about why the Il-2 existed. It wasn't created by someone trying to be clever or revolutionary. It was created by someone who couldn't accept the alternative, who couldn't sleep at night knowing pilots were dying in inadequate aircraft, who transformed moral urgency into engineering innovation. The story of the Il-2 Sturmovik is ultimately about more than an aircraft. It's about the power of conviction in the face of mockery. It's about the difference between expertise and wisdom. It's about how the most transformative innovations often come from people willing to be laughed at, dismissed, and called crazy. It's about how true leadership isn't about being right. It's about being committed to finding the right answer even when the path isn't clear. And here's the most powerful part. Every single one of those 36,000 aircraft represented lives saved. Pilots who came home, families who weren't destroyed, missions completed that would have been massacres in other aircraft. The flying coffin became the machine that defied death itself, bullet after bullet after bullet, and kept flying. So what can we learn from Sergey Ilyushin and his impossible aircraft? First, that innovation often looks insane before it looks inevitable. The greatest breakthroughs are almost always dismissed initially because they challenge fundamental assumptions. If your idea doesn't make some experts uncomfortable, you might not be thinking radically enough. Second, that expertise can be a trap. The designers who mocked Ilyushin weren't stupid or malicious. They were experienced, knowledgeable professionals applying conventional wisdom. But sometimes conventional wisdom is just collective cowardice. Sometimes, "That's how we've always done it," is the most dangerous phrase in any field. Third, that moral courage and technical innovation are inseparable. The Il-2 wasn't just an engineering achievement. It was an ethical statement. It said that protecting human life was more important than theoretical aerodynamic perfection. That functionality mattered more than elegance. That bringing people home was the highest design priority. Fourth, that redemption requires humility. The transformation of people like Petrov, the critics who had to confront their role in delaying a life-saving innovation, that's powerful. Growth requires the courage to admit you were wrong. And wisdom requires the grace to forgive those who doubted you. And finally, that the most meaningful measures of success aren't the ones we usually celebrate. We remember the Il-2 not because it was the fastest or the most beautiful or the most technically sophisticated aircraft. We remember it because it worked, because it saved lives, because it turned the tide when it mattered most. Today, the Il-2 Sturmovik stands in museums across Russia and the world. People look at its bulky, ungainly profile and find it hard to believe this aircraft terrified the German military. It doesn't look fierce. It doesn't look revolutionary. It looks like exactly what Ilyushin's critics said it would be. A flying tank, heavy and inelegant. But those dents in the armor tell a different story. Each one is a bullet that didn't kill someone. Each scar is a pilot who came home. Each patch of riveted steel is a life saved. If you ever find yourself with an idea that people say is impossible, remember Sergey Ilyushin standing in that committee meeting, calmly insisting that his flying tank would work. Remember that the experts laughed. Remember that they called it a coffin. And remember that he built it anyway, and it became the most produced combat aircraft in human history. If you've stuck with this story all the way through, I want you to do something for me. Hit that like button, not just because you enjoyed the video, but because you believe in the power of stubborn conviction against impossible odds. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories about people who refuse to accept no and change the world because of it. And drop a comment telling me about a time when you or someone you know pursued an impossible idea. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their crazy vision might just be exactly what the world needs. The legacy of the Il-2 isn't just military history. It's a reminder that the most important innovations come from people who care more about solving problems than about looking smart. From people who transform moral urgency into creative breakthroughs. From people who understand that impossible is just a dare in disguise. Sergey Ilyushin took 1,000 bullets, metaphorically and literally, for his vision, and he turned them into salvation.